Gentlemen, welcome to Master Sunday, and maybe more importantly, Palm Sunday for those like us who are celebrating the maybe most important week of our calendar. How are you guys doing?
Doing great. Great to be with you, and looking forward to this robust discussion with my brother
Doing
Stephen
well.
Lyon.
Yeah, doing well. Good to see everybody.
Amen. So I think before we begin, I want to kind of introduce the series for those at home and for you two. As far as what I kind of envisioned for this last year when we launched this, it's called the Foundations series, plural, not to be confused with the sci-fi trilogies. But my goal with this is essentially to bring attorneys on to to this platform to talk about what it's like being a Christian in their respective fields. And so I'm going to talk to you guys about what it was like being a Christian in your respective law schools, but then I'm going to really focus on what it's like being a Christian now in your legal practice. It's going to be an informal setting. We're just going to talk about what it's like, advice you have, habits you've developed. But before we begin, I want to kind of ask first Joe, then I'll go to Stephen to introduce yourself, talk about where you went to law school, and then what is the practice area that you're currently in, and maybe some of the other practice areas that you dabbled in your career.
Sure. Okay. Glad to do that. So I went to Brooklyn Law School, graduated back in 1992, eons ago. When I started practice, it was mostly litigation, mostly tort litigation, but it slowly developed into a multifaceted practice. Friends at church, business colleagues wanted me to do some of their business work and other things, and slowly started partnering with CLS attorneys, other attorneys who I was renting space with, and started to do more and more corporate work, which was what was my real interest during law school. I always wanted to be a business attorney. And so over the course of time, it pretty much morphed into that. In the last 15 years, more and more, the last 5 years, the tort work is very minimal. And most of my work now is outside general counsel work. And that involves, probably about 40 to 50 businesses and not-for-profits included in that. So some church denominations, some individual churches, some not-for-profits, also a lot of for-profit institutions. And I've got Lane Paulson, who's New York president of CLS, who's of counsel, senior counsel to the firm, who does, strictly the not-for-profit side of things. And so, there's still some litigation mixed into there, but a lot of it is transactional these days.
Thanks, man. Steven, what about you, man?
Um,
So I graduated from UConn Law in 2014. Um, I currently practice as a public defender. When I was in law school, I had zero interest in criminal law, but struggled to get employment when I got out of law school, and I was able to get a position as a clerk in the criminal court. Worked there for quite a few years on a temp basis, and then worked as a supervisor, supervising all our trial clerks and handling our appellate matters. And about 6 months ago, I got an opportunity to move over to the actual practitioner side of things. So I've been defending indigent clients for about 6 months now on the criminal side of things. Before that, I did dabble doing some moonlighting in environmental law and some gun range type law, but the majority of my experience has been on the criminal side.
Let me ask you this, Stephen. I think what I'm going to do in this conversation is kind of juxtapose different perspectives that you guys might have had with how you develop your thinking on this stuff. So, Stephen, this is going to be a non-faith question, but you said you didn't want to do criminal law. You said you didn't want to even touch it with a stick. What has compelled you to stay in that field after you've gained the experience and gained the opportunity to maybe move away from it?
I would say that a lot of it has been just trying to take the doors that God has opened for me, and see, trying to, instead of force him into my box, conform to what he seems to be leading me in that direction. I've applied for different positions over the years, trying to move out of that area, but it seems to be that this is an area that God wants me in. And so, as I've submitted to His will and His leading, these doors have opened up, and I've been decently successful in that area. So I'm trying to just submit myself and my will to His will.
Yeah. I love the contrast between you guys because I feel like, Steven, you have the area that's going to be the least conducive to being a good Christian because of the tensions that you will have with various forms of representation. But I'm sure Joe will bring a couple of other aspects of this that I don't even envision right now in regards to the kind of people you have to represent, because usually the tensions are created when there's a need for fulfilling their obligations of the law, the so-called code that lawyers abide by, which is basically just doing the biddings of their clients. But then also there's the code that we also have, the covenant code, in regards to our allegiance to God. So, Joe, let me go back to you, man. You went to Brooklyn, as you said. What was your expectation going in as a Christian? Were you a Christian going in? Let's ask that question first. And then
So
what were your expectations as a Christian going into Brooklyn Law as far as how your faith would interact with legal education?
that's a great question. So I went into law school uh, to use, Christian slang. I was backslidden. I knew the Lord, but I decided to, take a break. Let's say I was I wasn't outwardly, um, evoking my anger towards God, but I was under the surface angry with God because of some stuff that had happened in the prior, couple of years when I started law school, and so I just did my thing. And there was actually a Christian Legal Society
Hmm.
um, group at Brooklyn Law School, and I was friends with people that were in the Christian Legal Society at Brooklyn Law School. And they knew that I was a backslidden Christian. And they would ask me to come to, it was a small group, probably 5 or 6 people. At that time, they would ask me to come to the meeting. It was right after class. And I was like, no, I said, I just felt like I was a good friend. I told them, listen, I feel like I'd be a complete hypocrite to come to a meeting with where my heart is and where my head is, and so I never went to a law school CLS meeting. Although that friend was instrumental in me when I decided to rededicate my life to the Lord about 6 months after graduation. Uh, I reached out to him right away and said, "Hey, I need to go to CLS." Like I knew, because of what I was dealing with in the law firm that I was at, and I just knew, in my heart that I needed to be in fellowship with other Christian attorneys. And he told me about a CLS meeting. I think it was November of December. I think it was December probably of '92 at the Hebsibah House in New York City, and that was my first CLS meeting.
Man, Steven, what about you? Were you also a backslider going into law school?
I wouldn't have thought of myself as being a backslider going into law school. No, I was involved with CLS starting our the first meeting of my first semester I attended, and I don't know if I ever missed a meeting. I may have missed one during my 3 years of law
The front
school.
slider.
I was Yeah, I was Mr. Goody Two Shoes. No, my experience with Jesus in law school um, came from more. I don't know if you guys identify with this, but in undergrad, you can get away with outworking everybody else.
Hmm.
Um, and people think you're the smartest. But when you start getting into grad school and stuff, everyone was that person. And you realize that maybe just getting by on your wits is not enough for you to be the star pupil. And I struggled emotionally and psychologically with a lot of that. And so I had to come to terms with that. And part of that was leaning into Jesus and understanding that he was my source. He was how I was going to get through everything. So my relationship with Christ got much stronger throughout some of the law school challenges. But I was involved with CLS throughout law school. Started going to our regional retreats as a 2L. Um, yeah, so that's my law school background.
I appreciate what we have going on here, which is kind of a contrast of contrarieties. Joe, you're coming as a backslider. Steven's coming as a front slider. Joe is expecting to stay away from the CLS community. Steven's looking to start it up, to be engaged, to contribute. What happened during your legal education, Joe, that has perhaps changed your perspective on being a Christian in the legal practice of anything? I was wondering when you came of age in regards to your Christian maturity in the context of the legal profession.
Yeah, well, I mean, and by the way, I met good old Stephen at his 2L year at the Frost Valley to retreat. Phenomenal broomball player and multi-talented. So let's just put that on the record. But and I don't think he's missed a regional retreat in the last what, since then, probably 11 or 12, 13 years, whatever it is. So good stuff. But I had realized when I graduated from, when I decided to turn my life back around and submit my will to the Lord as opposed to just doing my own thing, that it was the Bible says that when you do turn your life back around, that He will restore you and restore that which the locust has eaten, and that happened to me. I was just back full in, and I knew that as a Christian and as an attorney that I needed to be with other Christians. And I saw in the law, I was working for a law firm um, that was really ethically challenged. And I was working there for about 5 months at that point. And the partner just was acting like he was the law. And in New York, it's the CPLR, which is your civil procedure rules. And I questioned something that he was doing, and I said, "This isn't in accordance with the CPLR." And he said to me, "I am the CPLR." And I said, "Okay, really?" So I didn't last there. Within like 2 or 3 weeks, we just had it out, and I was gone because I wasn't gonna, you know, you know, risk my legal career, and that was part of what drew me back to the Lord as well. I was like kind of like 20 years of school, you know, job at a law firm, and what, God, is this it? Is this what I'm going to be like, experiencing? And I felt God, the thought came to my mind, which I believe was God. What was the best time in your life? And I was like, well, Lord, it was when I was in love with you, which was back in my college days. And I immediately turned back around and went to that meeting, and then just had some great guys and gals that were part of CLS to mentor me as a young attorney, to give me guidance, to work on me with cases that I had that were beyond my experience. And what is the ethical code says? Partner with someone who has the experience, and then you're good. And so I began to do that more and more. Learned different areas of the law by doing that, and my practice it was about. I started my own practice in October of '94, so it was within 2 years of me making that decision to come back to the Lord. And I prayed about it.
Hmm.
And, there was confirmation all around. Yes, start your own practice. And it's been over 30 years, 30, be coming up on 31 years this fall. So, God's been faithful with regard to that.
Stephen, what about you, man? And I will ask you this question as an addendum to it as well, is kind of habits you developed since you were much more active in your CLS chapter at UConn to try to preserve your faith and kind of keep it at the forefront of your legal education. What kind of habits did you develop? So that there's a two-part question here. Obviously, how did you stay grounded? What kind of habits did you develop? And then also, how was your trajectory in those 3 years as a Christian going into legal practice? Did you ever have issues of backsliding? Did you ever have questions of doubt, or were you pretty much on the straight road the whole time and just continuing to really grow in your faith towards graduation?
Um, so the type of like disciplines and I would say that helped me through law school, honestly, CLS was one of the big things. I had my weekly meeting that it mattered. It didn't matter to me who showed up to that meeting. It mattered that I showed up to that meeting because it meant that I was making that a priority in my life. along with maintaining a commitment to my local church congregation as well. I still attended on a weekly basis, at least to my Sunday morning service, maintaining relationship with those outside of law school, because sometimes law school can be so overwhelming that it just takes over the entirety of your life and you forget that there's something outside of it.
Mm.
So I would say those were the probably the biggest areas of discipline. There are areas that I absolutely fell down into. My scripture reading bottomed out because you're doing so much reading of case law. You're like, I don't want to pick up a book, and that type of stuff. And sometimes, and that's still a struggle for me, is to make myself read. As much as I love reading, associate it with work, and so. But I would say making a priority for Christian fellowship, both on campus and off, were the biggest disciplines when I was there. Um, and as for transitioning out of law school and the things that helped, I think going to a secular law school, but being very open about my faith while I was at there, prepared me to deal with individuals who didn't believe the way I believed, but in a way that allowed me to function in a secular society without having to compromise. Like I remember, like I built relationships with people who were polar opposites of me to the point when I was in law school, I got invited by our diversity committee to during one of our weeks where the theme was the power of our narratives. They asked me to come talk about what life was like as a Christian in law school. So I got to share for 20 minutes at a state law school about my testimony and how Jesus had helped me in my struggles in law school.
Mm.
But none of that would have happened if I had been a jerk or been out acting like I was better than everyone else. I'm reminded my pastor used to say, the scripture says, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. This is nothing about those who are persecuted for being a jerk. And so I tried to make sure that my speech was gracious and winsome, as scripture says, seasoned with salt, so that any criticism or pushback was based on what I believed, not based on how I behaved. Um, and so when I transitioned into working in a courthouse and in my profession, I just kept a lot of those same disciplines and attitudes. I still maintain my relationship with my local church.
Mm.
Unfortunately, we didn't have and still don't have a Connecticut CLS chapter. We have started a New England chapter since, but I used to regularly attend. I still annually attend our regional retreats and maintain relationships with Christian lawyers who are maybe a slightly further distance, but make sure I have that relationship ongoing in case I have a question or an issue, like Mr. Ruta. I've got his phone number if I have a question. I don't know if that answers your question fully, but I'm happy to expound.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's going to be a fully answerable question in any of these things because there's just so much that you're kind of reflecting on in retrospect, especially from my own experience transitioning from Regent, which was very Christian, to Emory that had a keg every Thursday afternoon to blow off some steam, as they say, by providing people alcohol. You couldn't drink on Regent's campus. You couldn't smoke either. I didn't smoke or drink on campus. I didn't make that a habit, obviously, but even if I did, I couldn't do it or I'd be kicked out. So it was a very stark change, but at the same time, it was interesting because I was a lot stronger in my faith when I went to Emory because of what you just mentioned, Steve, in this regard that you went to a secular institution and you're surrounded by temptations that you needed to try to overcome. And so you start to develop habits to kind of fortify your faith in the, Ephesians 6 sense. Thanks for transitioning a little bit into legal practice, Joe. I'm going to come back to you and just ask you what was your expectations going into legal practice? Thinking about your faith more at this point? Were you still thinking about backsliding into a legal profession, or are you coming into your own a little bit and starting to kind of wrestle with these two dimensions?
No, well, so when I rededicated my life, I mean, it was full on considering my faith in the practice, right? And so that was when I got involved with Christian Legal Society in New York City. It was similar to Stephen at school, right? So you had all these different attorneys in New York City that were part of Christian Legal Society. When I went to that first meeting, there was probably at least 30 attorneys that were there. So it was a great community, and made a lot of friendships. Had lunch with different Christian attorneys. Was able to speak with them. Shared space with some of them. The very next year, I was sharing space with Bruce DeSico, Louis Trippett, who were both at the retreat, and just had a really nice community to be able to discuss things that came up, right? That were potentially gray area, whatever it might be. And then the other thing for me was I was in a really just a great church. I was at Times Square Church in Manhattan. I was involved in the missions group, so we had different leaders speaking every week on Wednesday nights, church Sundays. Went on a bunch of different mission trips, medical outreach trips, back in the 90s. So there was a lot of community for me, and a lot of support. I mean, I had different clients. I mean, I had some Christian clients just from meeting them at church and whatnot, but I also had just a lot of different types of clients that got referred over, and just maintained a good relationship with my clients. I mean, one of the keys, I think, as Christians, we submit ourselves to the Lord, and one of the things that I really firmly believed is that God was going to bring the people that He wanted me to assist in the legal practice to my office, right? That it wasn't going to just be random, and I prayed for that, and I prayed for wisdom as well on cases to take and cases not to take, right? And I really believe that God was gracious in that, that there were the I had a good relationship with my clients, right? I was very upfront with them about expectations. I thought as a Christian, it was really important to me to be a person who did what they said they were going to do, be responsive to my clients. I found as I was practicing law and witnessed what was happening with the lawyers, a lot of time lawyers would get into trouble when they were not being responsive to their clients, right? Where they were not communicating with their clients, and it would create a rift. It would create issues. So I always felt like it was really important from just being respectful to my clients, um, to be responsive, right? If they called, call them back. If they emailed, email them back, right? And not let them sit and wait, not ignore them. And if there were difficult issues, to be upfront with them about what it was. And I always felt like if you did that, that people respected it. And even if things weren't going, as they wanted them to go, but you know, just the reality of practicing law, right? You're not always going to get the decision that you want or the outcome that you want, right? So, but I always felt like if you were, you know, responsive and straightforward, that worked. And I used to tell, I did some work with doctors, um, and I saw with clients that if a doctor admitted that he did something wrong, and the doctor actually apologized to the client, the chances of that person suing that doctor was very minimal, because that people just wanted an acknowledgement and an apology, and even if they were damaged and something went wrong, most times they wouldn't want to bring an action. I had a client early on in my career who had a malpractice issue with an orthodontist, and all she wanted was a refund of her money, which was like $6,000. And the guy basically just said to her, like, take a walk, And I said to her that, listen, your damages aren't significant enough here. I said, but if you really want to pursue this, I mean, I can do it for you, but we'd have to do it on an hourly basis. She says, absolutely, I want to do it. She was so determined to get justice because of how he treated her. It worked out well. We got a favorable verdict, and just because this guy was very pompous, and it was very, very obvious to the jury. So just those kind of things really spoke to me, to just be straightforward, approachable, reliable, honest, in my describing the realities of cases and that kind of thing. So
Let me follow up, Joe, and I'll ask Steve about some of the habits he developed to stay faithful, but I'm not sure if Stephen has had clients um, until recently, so I don't want to prejudice his response here by not having the experience required for it. But Joe, you sound like you've dealt with clients on a number of occasions. So Joseph Allegretti talks about this idea of shifting on your perspective towards clients from a contract model to a covenant model where you have this additional care for them. You want to see their well-being, and you kind of he talks about this through perpetuity that once you're done with representation, you still have this covenant relationship with them, which I think is maybe a stretch as far as the realism of it. But certainly,
true.
did you see a shift in your own thinking about clients from this person is going to give me so much money and I'm going to win this case for them to a covenant model where you start seeing them as something more than just a means to an end?
Yeah, that's a great question, by the way. It really is a great question. Um, so, and I listen. I think I would have to credit that to my faith, right? Because God gives us a love for people, right? That's beyond us. That's one of the things that made me realize that God was real when I started to, accepted him. I started having this love for people, and I was like, "What is going on? It was so foreign." I mean, I like people, but actually having a burden and a love for people was wild to me, right? Just riding the subway in the city and just seeing people and having compassion for them. I knew that was God and not me. And so, with my clients, uh, the reality is, I mean, most of my clients, I'm friends with them. I've become friends with them, right? There develops a relationship. Especially, I've had clients for over 30 years that have stayed being. I had one client. He fired so many attorneys. It was just became laughable. And I knew the attorneys that he fired because of different specialties. And I said to him, I go, we'll call him X. I'm like, X, it's pretty amazing. I said, we've been doing work together now for over 30 years. I said, I think I'm the only lawyer you've never fired. And he goes, you know what? You're absolutely right. And it just, and he was not a Christian, but there was, I feel it was a God thing. There was a respect from him to me. And I don't know that I ever preached to him once, but he knew how I stood on things and he knew my ethics, right? And I made it very clear to him. And so it just worked out. But yeah, I mean, I would say it becomes, and it's a mixture of things for me, right? I just really like people. I get along with people. I grew up, as you know, Anton, in a summer resort environment, so I had a lot of people that were friends, and that was kind of my role as social director back then. But I think it's both. I mean, to me, it's um, there. It gets the relationship and the satisfaction becomes much deeper as you get closer to your clients, and as you form that relationship with them going forward, and they sense that you care, and it doesn't matter if Christian or not, right? It doesn't matter. I treat my clients the same. That they have this sense that you care for them and that you have their best interest at heart. And that is something. And I I'm an adjunct at Brooklyn Law School, and I had my first class, last fall. But I shared with them. I said, if your client believes that you're doing the right thing by them, and they can tell it's not for your economic benefit, but it's the right thing for them, they treasure that, right? And they will refer you so many more clients in business, and it will be made up to you. You don't your first um, loyalty has to be, I think, to your, even if you can get away with doing more time, doing more whatever, your first loyalty has to be to the best result for your client, even if it's not the best result for your law firm, right? You have to do what's best for them. And so I've found that when I could litigate something, and I said to them, listen, I could litigate this to you for you. I don't think it's worth it. I said, listen, at the end of the day, if you want to litigate this because you feel from uh, a standpoint of justice that you want to see a judgment, or you want to see some, I said, that's up to you. But I believe that if we resolve this, that it will be, yeah, it's to my detriment, because if we litigated it, obviously the firm would make a lot more money. I said, but I think for you, based on this and factor, I said, I would resolve this. And, I'll tell you, probably 95% of the time, the client will be like, yes, let's resolve it. And they're thankful, because we all know what litigation is like, right? It's so unpredictable. It's so expensive. And getting your pound of flesh usually isn't as satisfying as it seems when you want your pound of flesh, right? So that's another thing. I think as an attorney, as a believer, it's important to be able to explain that to your client, and maybe even educate your client in their best interests, because spending several years litigating something to, at the end of the day, get no more than what you would have gotten had you just resolved something way before and saved yourself all of that, all of that anxiety, all of that anger, et cetera, et cetera. So that's been really helpful for me in the practice.
Yeah, it's a great point, Joe, that you make, and I'll go to Stephen in a second. But I think it's continued to pull the same thread that Allegretti talks about. And one of the things you mentioned as far as seeking reconciliation is this counterintuitive notion that whenever you're going through your legal education, that you should try to balance the way that you develop your personality in the law as being litigation minded, A, but also mediation, arbitration minded. So they kind of have this mixture between being an adversary in the way that the law wants you to be, and then being a peacekeeper in the way that maybe your faith wants you to be. And I see, Joe, maybe if you want to comment on this a little bit as well, but it seems like the law school environment pushes you towards the adversarial model more than the peacekeeper model. And other people like Ken Sandy, obviously, there's a great book that came out recently by a professor at University of Texas Law named Stephen Collis. He talks about the importance of developing habits of a peacekeeper. And I think one of those ways is to try to take more classes that orient you towards mediation, arbitration, negotiation, and not so much litigation, trial, even appellate work at times is adversarial. Have you noticed a change in your own legal practice of being less litigation oriented and more peace oriented?
Yeah, I mean, I have, to the extent that I think it's beneficial to the client, right? Legal rates have gone higher and higher and higher.
Hmm.
Court congestion, especially since COVID, has gotten higher. Things are not getting resolved quickly. It's taking a long time.
Yeah.
And so you're if you can get a settlement for your client that is reasonable, right? It's always it's always better, I think, to have bird in the hand than two in the bush. And the client always makes the final decision, right? You give them the facts, you give them the pluses and minuses, right, of it, and then they choose. So, but the other thing that's kind of interesting too is we always would hear you should zealously represent your client, right? That's it. It's just zealous, and part of the course that I was teaching is, well, no, that's kind of changed, right? In a lot of jurisdictions, it's not just zealous now. It's really looking at the full picture of things, and you can take other things into consideration other than just being zealous. And so I think it's important to do that, because sometimes when you just take that zealous approach, and you're just like, let's litigate this, because you can do that, right? And I don't want to talk about what the intent of lawyers are, but you can manipulate a client if you want to rev them up into litigation, and let's go after them. And, well, that's what I want. I've had people come to me and say, I want to, are you aggressive? I want, and I'm like, when I hear that, it's kind of like a warning sign, right? Because I understand that they're looking for a pit bull that really wants to go after the other side. And the reality is that when you have someone who wants to just take that kind of an attitude in litigation, that if things don't go their way, who's the first person they're going to blame, right? They're not going to blame themselves, right? They're going to blame you, right? And so that's another thing of discernment, wisdom in what is the attitude of the client. Because if this client just, listen, there are righteous causes, right, where you have no choice but to litigate, and to litigate aggressively, right? There are those situations, but I think most of the time, you have an ability, or there's this, there's the opportunity to not take this real adversarial approach, and even in litigation, be able to speak to your adversary, be able to have a real discussion, be able to try and bring resolution. And listen, civility is one of the most important things, right? I mean, even in litigation with your adversary, I have been able to get so much better results for my client by being approachable, civil, friendly,
Mm.
with my adversaries, even at trial. I mean, we've settled cases at trial. I have another attorney who'll pull me into trials, and he's very, he's very aggressive in his litigation approach, and he's just very focused, and he realized that it wasn't really helping him to get cases resolved, because you go to trial, and some are sometimes you get a plaintiff's verdict, and sometimes you get a defense verdict, right? And I said, you've got to stop creating an enemy on the other side. I understand you want to be aggressive, but that defense lawyer is sometimes your best friend, and you need to be civil, and you need to form a relationship. So he started pulling me in his second seat, and that's what I did. I would form a relationship with the other side, and we get the case settled. And the clients were happy. He was happy. You didn't have to take the chance of getting to a verdict. And by the way, most defense counsel, if you ask them, honestly, do they want to get a defense verdict? Yeah, it'd be nice, but do they want to take the risk? No. Right? Most attorneys want to resolve the case, even on the defense side. They're like, okay, the carrier's happy with it, your client's happy with it, everyone's good.
Mm.
Let's move on.
It's interesting because a lot of what you're talking about really does pin the current legal culture in two juxtaposing positions. One on the hired gun mentality, which you're seeing a lot now with some of these litigations going through involving the government, and others who are more ethically concerned about the state of the legal profession and what it means for them to not only work for these firms, but also represent some of these underlying parties from the standpoint of their conscience. Stephen, I want to go to you on this because it's a perfect segue to the work you do, because you are in an area that is prone to developing a sense of callousness towards your client, because the criminal sector does have some unsavory folks in there. And more than that, you've got some unsavory folks on the other side that is going to push, quote unquote, those accused towards plea agreements that are going to be, relatively unfair at times. And, it's done by holding up the threat of longer time in regards to settling something down that isn't really just in regards to what the crime was. So maybe talk to me a little bit about how you're navigating your faith with a environment like the criminal sector.
Yeah, you're not wrong regarding all of those aspects. I think one of the benefits that I've had from not starting immediately as a litigator in that field, but working in the clerk's office, the neutral side, has given me time to be in that environment and understand the different dynamics and being able to create some disciplines beforehand. Because even in a neutral side, you can start to make assumptions now. You forget the presumption of innocent. Every person who comes to the window, they're just some scumbag that's trying to ruin society. And then you have to take a step back and you're like, no, these are individuals, not only from a legal perspective, have a presumption of innocence, but from a Christian perspective, they are just as much made in the image of God as I am. They have that imago Dei. And so it can become very difficult to not lose track of that. Um, when it's come to representing individuals, um, it is slightly, it is much harder than I would say in private practice to try to move away from an adversarial system because, first of all, um, your client doesn't have a choice in their attorney. You get assigned me, I'm your attorney. There's no firing me because you don't like the way that I'm handling things, unless you can prove that I haven't that I've been ineffective counsel. I'm it. And so it's a little bit more delicate of a balance of trying to superimpose my faith view regarding how we should be resolving this dispute. Um, I have to first win you over and then try to win over the prosecutor in negotiations. And it's the one area where we do see some non-litigation side is probably, at least in Connecticut, we have a good number of state funded or even private charitable funded programs. So when you're dealing with individuals who are, they would say they're crimes of harm to themselves, but not others. So substance abuse issues, possession of that kind of stuff, that you can go to the prosecutor and say, hey, yeah, my guy got pulled over. He had this on him, no criminal record. And you can say, hey, what if he goes and does 2 months of treatment and then they'll drop the case? So we do get a lot of that. So that's the closest thing we get to non-plea negotiations. But no, a lot of it is plea negotiations. And I had a client a couple weeks ago where there's an ethical struggle where he had 9 files pending against him. Um, and we had a decent resolution, but it required him to plead guilty to a charge that he was absolutely determined to say that he did not do. The issue hit for him was that, yeah, maybe they couldn't prove that charge, but they could prove the whole list of the other ones.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, maybe he'd be found guilty or not guilty on that one, but he'd have 40 years hanging over his head if they took him to trial on all the others. So, trying to have a discussion with him saying, I understand you have that issue and you have that feeling of justice in your head. But the long term for you, what is going to be best for you in your life, will plead under what's called the Alford Doctrine, which means that I disagree with the statements that are being made, but I'm willing to take this agreement in order to resolve the matter. Uh, and I am okay with what he did. Because while I agree that they could have struggled to prove that charge, they could have very easily convicted him of 6 other felonies, and he would be way worse off. But it was a struggle. It was a struggle to get him to think about it from his long-term perspective, as opposed to sticking on that one piece of minutia.
Let me ask you this, Stephen, and I'm asking Joe a lot of softballs here. I'm asking you the harder questions because you're in a much more harder context. But what have you developed from your Christian standpoint in order to try to meet the demands of representing someone you feel is guilty? And I'm really thinking about two different scriptures here. Obviously, there's the false testimony in Exodus, I think 20, and then there's the one, I think, in Proverbs about acquitting the guilty. How do you balance being a Christian and also representing clients that you know are guilty but are still entitled to due process?
So I've come at it from a sense that there's a difference between legal culpability and moral guilt. Um, our system is set up that in order for someone to be proven beyond a reasonable, proven guilty, be found guilty, it has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And the burden for that is on the state, the prosecution. So if someone who I believe has done such and such crime is not found guilty, I don't think of it as I got them off.
Mm.
It's that the state didn't meet the burden of proof that's required by our system. That doesn't make them any less culpable in the eyes of God or even just society, but from a legal standpoint, with the purpose of taking away someone's liberty. That's where I come down on that particular issue. And another area you can make an argument is justice. Where does justice come in here? Because someone may be technically guilty of the crime that they're charged with, but with them getting the legal penalty that comes with it actually be justice in this situation? What are the mitigating factors? What are the other issues that come to play? So those are some of the things that I go through. But honestly, I it's a case by case struggle often. And I try to make sure that when I speak with my clients that I'm realistic with them, um, and that I don't act like things that they've done that are wrong aren't wrong. Um, I say that I'm on their side. I'm defending them, but I don't try to justify their actions in my conversations with them. And if we're bringing in the faith side, I haven't had a lot of questions that have talked about faith or clients that have talked about faith with me, but I did have one who tried to write a letter to a judge talking about his faith in prison and how he was asking for a second chance and all that thing. And I remember taking that letter and writing him a letter that said, "Well, I appreciate and I'm glad that he's working on his faith, and I want him to continue doing that. I'm not giving this letter to the judge. This is not going to look well for you." And then, but I did get the opportunity when he came in from the correctional facility, came to the courthouse I asked him, I said, "You did talk about your faith in this letter. Would you like to pray before we go upstairs?" And I didn't pray for him that he would get a better deal. I didn't pray for him that he would miraculously get out. I prayed that his faith would be strong and that God's will would be done in his case and that he would submit to what God had for him in this scenario.
I'm thinking about John 8, obviously. I'm thinking about that woman who was caught in adultery, and I'm thinking about the implication of due process that Christ wanted to invoke in regards to having to bring both quote unquote accused parties. I'm not going to say guilty parties, but accused parties. And the fact that there is importance to due process that we're seeing now in America as being kind of overlooked to try to get rid of people that I have no sympathy for if they're truly part of any forms of gangs and violence. But still, we are a country that has been founded on the importance of due process for the sake of having safeguards to protect the innocent. Joe, do you think about in your respective? I'm going to be having one or two more questions here, guys. So, this one is more broad, and Stephen, you get to think about this a little bit. But Joe, do you think about the service that you provide to each client as part of a larger framework of creating a more just legal system?
Yeah, I mean, I I don't know how often I contemplate it, but I believe the way I run my practice in our law firm that we we contribute we hopefully contribute to that, right? That's part of the whole idea is to foster that, right? And the interesting thing is that I think sometimes through settlements you achieve that better because sometimes the other is the extreme, right? It's an all or nothing, right? Because if especially if it's a litigation standpoint, right? One side wins, one side loses, and as we know, there's times where one side's 100% wrong and the other 100 side's 100% right, but that's rare, right? So, when you look at a lot of matters, there's typically, especially in business disputes, right? There's typically, issues on both sides. You didn't do this, you didn't do that, and they're trying to resolve it. So I think fostering resolution and getting there, and also just informing your clients as to what the law is, what the reality is. You know, keeping in mind that you are an advocate for your client, but you're also someone who has a responsibility, right, to consider what the law is and try and present things in a way that is um, that's being an advocate for your client, even a zealous advocate, you can argue, right? But also what's the reality of it and what's justice and what's fair. And then sometimes it's just out of your hands, right? Because if you are going to go to trial and you're relying on a judge's decision or a jury's verdict, you do the best you can, and then it's up to them. And so that's why I think when you just see mediation becoming more and more prevalent, I think, because clients realize, I don't know that I want to take the risk on an all or nothing and spend all that money on legal fees for an all or nothing. That's the other interesting thing. I get clients, you may get a kick out of this, and they're like, I wish it was the European system. Like they wish that, if you're going to, because, there's also the point where people are getting sued and they shouldn't be getting sued, right? There's actions that really are, you can argue, are frivolous, but they just kind of meet the criteria to not be frivolous, and they're bringing someone into court and they're wasting, and so now this client is like, what am I going to do? I'm going to litigate this for 2 or 3 years and spend all this money, and then the judge is going to say, well, you should give them 20%. So now I've given them like 100% of what they wanted anyway because of the amount of time and legal fees. And they'll say, I wish there was a legal fee provision, because if there was, if you don't prevail, that you pay the other side's legal fees. It's an interesting aspect, right? Because it's kind of uh, a check and balance, so to speak, right? If you think you have a good action and you think you really believe that you've been wronged, and you're willing to go all the way, and if you lose, that you're going to pay the other side's legal fees, I think it would reduce a lot of the litigation in this country. I really do. And I'm not saying I'm advocating it for sure, but I think there needs to be something needs to change, because you have businesses and individuals that are bringing lawsuits really that have no business in being brought. And they're doing it because they know they can, and they know that the other side will have to spend a lot of money in legal fees, and they would rather resolve than do that. So there's that, it kind of goes both ways, right? You want to resolve when it's appropriate to do so, because it's just, you're trying to get to a fair resolution. But there's times when really, and this happens, where you say to a client, listen, I think this is a bogus lawsuit. I'm just telling you, but I think, they're willing to take X amount of dollars to settle this. And I know you'd rather not pay it because you don't think there's any validity of their lawsuit. But there's enough of a material issue of fact here that they're going to get through they're going to get through a motion dismissed. They're going to get through a summary judgment motion. And now you're stuck litigating this for 4 years.
Yeah.
And to me, there needs to be some kind of resolution to that. That's because it's jamming up our court systems, and it's creating an unfair situation.
The jamming up of the court systems is it's definitely a real thing. I think
Yeah.
it was David French, but he was quoting someone else. He had a line where he said, "The beauty of the American justice system is that everyone is entitled to their decade in court."
Yeah.
Um, there's really something to that. I struggle to get to a place where I think that in my role I can impact any sort of systematic change. And just because of the nature of the beast, I average somewhere around 150 clients and 250 files at a time. And so the way I tend to feel that I can use my faith and my position to impact the system is less from a macro perspective, but from a micro perspective is, and I think the faith is the only way I'm able to do this. Is my goal is when I meet each individual is to make them feel like they are actually being heard. That even if it doesn't reach the resolution that they care about or that they want, that they feel that someone cared about them enough to actually try to hear their perspective, know what they're going through, and see the humanity in them. Because you can become a number that's just being pushed through the system. And you, I'm like, and it becomes easy. This is not me judging people who get to there. I could get there easily. Deal with prosecutors all the time that just see the alleged charge and it's just one more criminal, one more thing. But you forget that behind each file is a person who's made in the image of God, who is no more deserving of God's wrath than any of us are in our fallen state. And so trying to make them feel heard and to make them at least see, you know what, the stereotype of the public pretender or someone who's just part of the system pushing them through wants to make them take a deal so that they can get the case over with, that wasn't the case for them. So that in whatever situation is that you build that that reputation for yourself and with your office that yes, we are, quote, part of the system, but we are not defined by the system. We are defined by caring for our clients and doing our best, the best that we can by them.
I think it's important to emphasize the importance of small victories. Obviously, in your world, in your faith, the incremental growth of a person's Christian conviction is layered by small individual decisions to go to church, to read your Bible, to ask meaningful questions when you're in company of other people that helps sharpen one another in the development of their faith. I had a really good conversation with a student of that you guys have just met at the Northeast Retreat, Janelle Angus, who talked to me about getting through law school as a black student. Really required her to embrace the importance of small victories. And I think that, Stephen, you're talking about a very important aspect of not only faith development, but also getting through a legal system and trying to incrementally change the system through small victories is something that is it's unstated, but I think it is important because it helps you kind of prioritize each one of your clients as someone that can create the individual pieces towards a greater change. And I suspect there's a history of litigants who have started with small moves that have, culminated in large movements in the long run. This also happens on the other side where bad decisions from individuals create a huge host of problems and million-dollar verdicts because they just didn't stop talking or they didn't actually use good judgment in approaching or pursuing certain people. So I've seen how the law can change for good and for ill based on small individual incremental decisions that aggregate into something much larger. In light of that, Joe, last question to you. Advice you would give to your younger self going into your first year as a law student and wanting to stay faithful to to God.
As a law student would have been, I should have repented and turned back to God my 1L a year instead of waiting until after law school. That would have been really a really good thing. I would say, you know, to people that might listen to this that are, you know, disappointed because something didn't go their way and um, or may have some kind of tragedy or real difficult situation and you're blaming God. My advice, and I mean this from a humble place, is to turn back to God because um, He will work it out. He is the way to go. It was amazing how when I, turned back to God, how He opened so many wonderful doors and just the peace that was there and guidance and direction and fellowship and purpose in life. It just all came rushing back. I mean, He was very merciful. So for me, that would be that would be my advice. Definitely, if you're out there and you're a Christian attorney or you maybe you've allowed yourself to kind of get really caught up in your work and you've not been fellowshipping, you've not been going to church. Um, you know, turn that around. Make that decision to draw close to the Lord. It says, if you draw close to Him, He will draw close to you, and it changes everything. It really did for me. It changed everything. So.
What about you, Stephen? Advice you would give to your 1L self.
I would, I'm going to jump off about what Joe said about um, uh, when you reaching out to God yourself, as in, I don't know, I can only speak for myself and my 1L experience. Things didn't go the way I thought they were going to go. I didn't get the grades I thought I was going to get. I wasn't getting the job leads or the connections that I thought I was going to get. And I struggled a lot. And I had grown up in a Christian home. I had known these things from a theoretical perspective, but I hadn't had lots of hardship, had lots of adversity. So I hadn't had to understand what coping mechanisms and what things I have had to do to deal with those moments. And I'm reminded of a sermon I heard from Tim Keller a couple years ago where he was talking about Scripture refers to David as a man after God's own heart. And David is full of sin. He's full of doubt. He's full of all these different things in his life. But you see throughout the Psalms, the thing that makes him special is he brings them all to God. He brings his doubts to God. He brings his fears, his anger. He doesn't let his stresses and his doubts pull him from his relationship. He brings them to God and says, God, I'm struggling here. What do I do? And that helped. I started doing that near the end of my law school career. And I wish I had started doing that at the beginning because that resulted in not only a better psychological space for myself, but spiritual growth just jumped forward when I started coming to God with those issues as opposed to hiding them in or feeling like, oh, I'm a bad Christian because I'm dealing with these struggles. No, bring them to God. Your your struggles, your issues that you're dealing with, first of all, they're not special to you. Everyone is dealing with those issues, and God isn't scared of them. They're not too big for him.